6. Teresa went in to get dressed and stood in front of the large mirror. No, there was nothing monstrous about her body. She had no pouches hanging from her shoulders. In fact, her breasts were quite small. Her mother used to ridicule her for having such small breasts, and she had had a complex about them until Tomas came along, but reconciled to their size as she was still mortified by the very large, very dark circles around her nipples. Had she been able to design her own body, she would have chosen inconspicuous nipples, the kind that scarcely protrude from the arch of the breast, but all but blend in color with the rest of the skin. She thought of her areolae as being big crimson targets, painted by a primitivist of pornography for the poor. Looking at herself, she wondered what she would be like if her nose grew a millimeter a day. How long would it take before her face began to look like someone else's? And if various parts of her body began to grow and shrink and Teresa no longer looked like herself, would she still be herself? Would she still be Teresa? Of course. Even if Teresa were completely unlike Teresa, her soul inside her would be the same and look on in amazement at what was happening to her body. Then what was the relationship between Teresa and her body? Had her body the right to call itself Teresa? And if not, then what did the name refer to? Merely something incorporeal, intangible? These are the questions that have been going through Teresa's head since she was a child. Indeed, the only truly serious questions are the ones that even a child can formulate. Only the most naive of questions are truly serious. They are the questions with no answers. A question with no answer is a barrier that cannot be breached. In other words, it is questions with no answers that set the limits of human possibilities, describe the boundaries of human existence. Teresa stood bewitched before the mirror, staring at her body as if it were alien to her. Alien, and yet assigned to her and no one else. She felt disgusted by it. It lacked the power to become the only body in Tomas's life, and it disappointed and deceived her. At night she had to inhale the aroma of another woman's groin from his hair. Suddenly she longed to dismiss her body, as one dismisses a servant, to stay on with Tomas only as a soul and send her body into the world to behave as other female bodies behave with male bodies. If her body had failed to become the only body for Tomas, and thereby lost her the biggest battle of her life, it could just well go off on his own. 7. She went home and forced herself to eat a stand-up lunch in the kitchen. At 3:30 she put Karen on his leash and walking again to the outskirts of town where her hotel was. When they fired Teresa from her job at the magazine, she found work behind the bar of a hotel. It happened several months after she came back from Zurich. They would not forgive her in the end for the week she spent photographing Russian tanks. She got the job through friends, other people who had taken refuge when thrown out of work by the Russians, a former professor of theology in the accounting office, an ambassador who had protested against the invasion on foreign television at the reception desk. She was worried about her legs again. While working as a waitress in the small-town restaurant, she had been horrified at the sight of the old waitress's varicose veins, a professional hazard that came with a life of walking, running, and standing with heavy loads. But the new job was less demanding. Although she began each shift by dragging out heavy cases of beer and mineral water, all she had to do then was stand behind the bar, serve the customers their drinks, and wash out the glasses in the small sink on her side of the bar. And through it all she had Karen lying docilely at her feet. It was long past midnight before she had finished her accounts and delivered the cash receipts to the hotel director. She then went to say goodbye to the ambassador who had night duty. The door behind the reception desk led to a tiny room with a narrow cot where he could take a nap. The wall above the cot was covered with framed photographs of himself and various people smiling at the camera, or shaking his hand, or sitting next to him at a table and signing something or other. Some of them were autographed. In the place of honor hung a picture showing side by side with his own face the smiling face of John F. Kennedy. When Teresa entered the room at night, she found him talking not to Kennedy but to a man about 60 whom she had never seen before and who fell silent as soon as he saw her. "It's all right," said the ambassador. "She's a friend. You can speak freely in front of her." Then he turned to Teresa. "His son got 5 years today." During the first days of the invasion, she learned the man's son and some friends stood watch over the entrance to a building housing the Russian Army Special Staff. Since any Czechs they saw coming or going were clearly agents in the service of other Russians, she and his friends tailed them, traced the number of plates on their cars, passed on the information to the pro-Dubček clandestine radio and television broadcasters, who then warned the public. In the process, the boy and his friends had given one of the tailorders a thorough going over. The boy's father said this photograph was the only corpus delicti. He denied it all until they showed it to him. He took a clipping out of his wallet. It came out in the Times in the autumn of 1968. It was a picture of a young man grabbing another man by the throat and a crowd looking on in the background. "Collaborator punished," read the caption. Teresa let out her breath. No, it wasn't one of hers. Walking home with Karenin through the nocturnal Prague, she thought of the days she had spent photographing tanks How naive they had been, thinking that they were risking their lives for their country when in fact they were helping the Russian police. She got home at 1:30. Tomas was asleep. His hair gave off the aroma of another woman's groin. 8. What is flirtation? One may say that it is behavioral, leading another to believe that sexual intimacy is possible, while preventing that possibility from becoming a certainty. In other words, flirting is a promise of sexual intercourse without a guarantee. When Teresa stood behind the bar, the men whose drinks she poured flirted with her. Was she annoyed by the unending ebb and flow of flattery, double entendres, off-color stories, propositions, smiles, and glances? Not in the least. She had an irresistible desire to expose her body, the alien body she wanted to expel into the big wide open world, to the undertow. Tomas kept trying to convince her that love and lovemaking were two different things. She refused to understand. Now she was surrounded by men she did not care for in the slightest. What would making love with them be like? She yearned to try it, if only in the form of that no-guarantee promise called flirting. Let there be no mistake. Teresa did not wish to revenge on Tomas. She merely wished to find a way out of the maze. She knew that she had to become a burden to him. She took things too seriously, turning everything into a tragedy, and failed to grasp the lightness and amusing insignificance of physical love. How she wished she could learn lightness. She yearned for someone to help her out of the anachronistic shell. If for some women flirting is a second nature, insignificant routine, for Teresa had developed into an important field of research with the goal of teaching her who she was and what she was capable of. But by making it important and serious, she deprived it of its lightness, and it became forced, labored, overdone. She disturbed the balance between promise and lack of guarantee, which, when maintained, is a sign of altruistic virtuosity. She promised too ardently, and without making it clear that the promise involved no guarantee on her part, which is another way of saying that she gave everyone the impression of being there for the taking. But when men responded by asking for what they felt they had been promised, they met with strong resistance, and their only explanation for it was that she was deceitful and malicious. 9. One day, a boy of about 16 perched himself on a bar stool and dropped a few provocative phrases that stood out in the general conversation like a false line in a drawing, a line that can neither be continued nor erased. There's some pair of legs you've got there. So you can see through wood, she fired back. I watched you in the street, he responded, but by then she had turned away and was serving another customer. When she had finished, he ordered a cognac. She shook her head. But I'm 18, he objected. May I see your identification card? Teresa said. You may not, the boy answered. Then how about a soft drink, said Teresa. Without a word, the boy stood up from the soft bar stool and left. He was back about a half hour later. With exaggerated gestures, he took a seat at the bar. There was enough alcohol in his breath to cover a 10-foot radius. Give me that soft drink, he commanded. Why, you're drunk, said Teresa. The boy pointed to a sign hanging on the wall behind Teresa's back. Sale of alcoholic beverages to minors is strictly prohibited. You are prohibited from serving me alcohol, he said, sweeping his arm for the sign to Teresa. But I am not prohibited from being drunk. Where did you get so drunk? Teresa asked. In the bar across the street, he said, laughing, and asked for it again for a soft drink. Well, why don't you stay there? Because I wanted to look at you, he said. I love you. His face contorted oddly as he said it. Teresa had a trouble deciding whether he was sneering, making advantages, or joking. Or was he simply so drunk that he had no idea what he was saying? She put the soft drink down in front of him and went back to other customers. The I love you seemed to have exhausted the boy's resources. He emptied his glass in silence, left money on the counter, and slipped out before Teresa had time to look up again. A moment after he left, a short, bald-headed man, who was on his third vodka, said, You ought to know that serving young people alcohol is against the law. I didn't serve him alcohol. That was a soft drink. I saw it. You slipped into it. What are you talking about? Give me another vodka, said the bald man, and added, I've had my eye on you for some time now. Then why not be grateful for the view of a beautiful woman and keep your mouth shut? She interjected a tall man who had stepped up to the bar in time to observe the entire scene. You stay out of this, shouted the bald man. What business is it of yours? And what business is it of yours, if I may ask? The tall man retorted. Teresa served the bald man his vodka. He drowned it at one gulp, paid, and departed. Thank you, said Teresa to the tall man. Don't mention it, said the tall man, and went his way to 10. A few days later he turned up at the bar again. When she saw him, she smiled at him like a friend. Thanks again. That bald fellow comes in all the time. He's terribly unpleasant. Forget him. What makes him want to hurt me? He is a petty little drunk. Forget him. If you say so. The tall man looked in her eyes. Promise? I promise. I like hearing you make me promises, he said, still looking in her eyes. The flirtation was on, the behavior leading another to believe that sexual intimacy is possible, even though the possibility itself remains in the realm of theory and suspense. What's a beautiful girl like you doing in the ugliest part of Prague? And you, she countered, what are you doing in the ugliest part of Prague? He told her he lived nearby. He was an engineer and had stopped off on his way home from work the other day by sheer chance. When Teresa looked at Tomas, her eyes were not in his eyes, but to a point 3 or 4 inches higher to his hair, which gave off the aroma of another woman's groins. "I can't take it any more, Tomas. I know I shouldn't complain ever since you came back from Prague from me. I've forbidden myself to be jealous. I don't want to be jealous. I suppose I'm not strong enough to stand up to it. Help me, please." He put his arms in hers and took her to the park where the years before they had gone on frequent walks. The park had red, blue, and yellow benches. They sat down. "I understand you. I know what you want," said Tomas. "I've taken care of everything. All you have to do is climb Petrin Hill." Petrin Hill? She felt a surge of anxiety. Why Petrin Hill? You'll see why when you get up there. She was terribly upset about the idea of going. Her body was so weak that she could scarcely lift it off the bench, but she was constitutionally unable to disobey Thomas. She forced herself to stand. She looked back. He was sitting on the bench, smiling at her almost cheerfully. With a wave of the hand, he signaled her to move on. 12. Coming out at the foot of Petrin Hill, that great green mound, rising up in the middle of Prague, she was surprised to find it devoid of people. This was strange because at other times half of Prague seemed to be milling about. It made her anxious, but the hill was so quiet and the quiet so comforting that she yielded to its embrace. On her way up, she paused several times to look back. Below her, she saw the towers and the bridges. The saints were shaking their fists and lifting their stone eyes to the clouds. It was the most beautiful city in the world. At last she reached the top. Beyond the ice cream and souvenir stands, none of which happened to be open, stretched a broad lawn, spotted here and there with trees. She noticed several men on the lawn. The closer she came to them, the slower she walked. There were 6 in all. They were standing on strolling at a leisurely pace like golfers, looking over the course and weighing various clubs in their hands, trying to get into the proper frame of mind for a match. She finally came near them. Of the 6 men, 3 were there to play the same role as she. They were unsettled. They seemed eager to ask all sorts of questions, but feared making nuisances of themselves, and so held their tongues and merely looked about inquisitively. The other 3 radiated condescending benevolence. One of them had a rifle in his hand. Spotting Teresa, he waved at her and said with a smile, "Yes, this is the place." She gave a nod in reply, but still felt extremely anxious. The man added, "To avoid an error, this was your choice, wasn't it?" It would have been easy to say, No, it wasn't my choice at all," but she could not imagine disappointing Tomas. What excuse, what apology could she find for going back home? And so she said, "Yes, of course it was my choice." The man with the rifle continued, "Let me explain why I wish to know. The only time we wish to do this is when we are certain, and the people who come to us have chosen to die of their own accord. We consider it a service." He gave her so quizzical a glance that she had to assure him once more. No, don't worry, it was my choice. "Would you like to go first?" he asked, because she wanted to put off the execution. As long as she could, she said, "No, please, no, it's all possible. I'd like to be last." "As you please," he said, and went off to the others. Neither of his assistants were armed. Their sole function was to attend to the people who were to die. They took them by the arms and walked them across the lawn. The grassy surface proved quite an expanse, and ran as far as the eye could see. The people to be executed were allowed to choose their own trees. They paused at each one and looked it over carefully, unable to make up their minds. 2 of them eventually chose plain trees, but the third wandered on, no tree apparently striking him as worthy of his death. The assistant who told him by the arm guided him along gently and patiently until at last the man lost the courage to go on and stopped at a luxuriant maple. Then the assistants blindfolded all 3 men, and so the 3 men, their eyes blindfolded, their heads turned to the sky, stood with their backs against the trees on the endless lawn. The man in the rifle took aim and fired. There was nothing to be heard but the singing of birds. The rifle was equipped with a silencing device. There was nothing to be seen but the collapse of the man who had been leaning against the maple. Without taking a step, the man with the rifle turned in a different direction, and one of the other men silently crumpled. And seconds later, again the man with the rifle merely turned in place. The third man sank to the lawn. 13. One of the assistants went up to Teresa, who was holding a dark blue ribbon. She realized he had come to blindfold her. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I want to watch." But that was not the real reason she refused to be blindfolded. She was not one of those heroic types who are determined to stare down the firing squad. She simply wanted to postpone death. Once her eyes were covered, she would be in death's antechamber. From there was no return. The man did not force her. He merely took her on. But as they walked across the open lawn, Teresa was unable to choose a tree. No one forced her to hurry, but she knew that in the end she would not escape. Seeing a flowering chestnut ahead of her, she walked up and stopped in front of it. She leaned her back against its trunk and looked up. She saw the leaves resplendent in the sun. She heard the sounds of the city, faint and sweet like 1,000 distant violins. The man raised his rifle. Teresa felt her courage slipping away. Her weakness drove her to despair, but she could do nothing to counteract it. "But it wasn't my choice," she said. He immediately lowered the barrel of his rifle, and a gentle voice said, "If it wasn't your choice, we can't do it. We haven't the right." He said it kindly, as if apologizing to Teresa for not being able to shoot her, and if it was not her choice. his kindness toward her heartstrings. She turned her face to the bark of the tree and burst into tears. 14. Her whole body racked with sobs. She embraced the tree as if it were not a tree and it were her long-lost father or grandfather. She had never known a great-grandfather, a great-great-grandfather, a hoary old man come to her for the depths of time to offer his face in the form of the rough tree bark. So then she turned her head. The three men were far off in the distance by them watering across the greensward. Like golfers, the one with the rifle even held it like a golf club, walking down the paths of Petron Hill. She could not wean her thoughts from the man who was supposed to shoot her, but did not. Oh, how she longed for him. Someone had to help her after all. Tomas wouldn't. Tomas was sitting a true death. Someone else would have to help her. The closer she got to the city, the more she longed for the man with the rifle, and the more she feared Tomas. He would never forgive her for failing to keep her word. She would never forgive her cowardice, her betrayal. She had come to the street where they lived and knew she would see him in a minute or two. She was so afraid of seeing him that her stomach was in knots at the thought of it. She was going to be sick. 15. The engineer started to lure up to his flat. She refused the first two invitations, but accepted the third. After her usual stand-up lunch in the kitchen, she set off. It was just before 2. As she approached his house, she could feel her legs slowing down of their own accord. But then it occurred to her that she was actually being sent to him by Tomas. Hadn't he told her time and time again that love and sexuality had nothing in common? Well, she was merely testing his words, confirming them. She could almost hear him and say, I understand you, I know what you want, I've taken care of everything, you'll see when you get up there. Yet all she was doing was following Tomas's commands. She wouldn't stay long enough for a cup of coffee, long enough to feel like what it's like to be on the very border of infidelity. She would push her body up to the board, let it stand there for a moment at the stake, and then when the engineer tried to put his arms around her, she would say, as she said to the man with the rifle on Petron Hill, it wasn't my choice, whereupon the man would lower the barrel of his rifle and say in a gentle voice, if it wasn't your choice, I can't do it, I haven't the right, and then she would turn her face to the bark of the tree and burst into tears. 16. The building had been constructed at the turn of the century in the workers' district of Prague. She entered a hall with dirty whitewashed walls, climbed a flight of worn stone stairs with iron banisters, and turned to the left. It was the second floor, no name, no bell. She knocked. He opened the door. The entire flat consisted of a single room, with a curtain setting off the first 5 or 6 feet from the rest, and therefore forming a kind of makeshift anteroom. It had a table, a hot plate, and a refrigerator. Stepping beyond the curtain, she saw the oblong of a window at the end of a long, narrow space, with the books along one side, and a daybed and armchair against the other. It's a very simple place I have here, said the engineer. I hope you don't find it depressing. No, not at all, said Teresa, looking over the wall covered with bookshelves. It had no desk, but hundreds of books. She liked seeing them, and the anxiety that had plagued her died down somewhat. From childhood she regarded books as the emblems of a secret brotherhood. A man with his sort of library couldn't possibly hurt her. He asked her what she liked to drink. Wine? No, wine, coffee, if anything. He disappeared behind the curtain. She went over to the bookshelves. On one of the books caught her eyes once. It was a translation of Sophocles' Oedipus. How odd to find it here. Years ago Tomas had given it to her. After she had read it, he went on and on about it. Then he sent his reflections to a newspaper, and the article turned their life upside down, but now just looking at the spine of the book seemed to calm her. It made her feel as though Tomas purposefully left a trace, a message that her presence here was his doing. She took off the book of the shelf and opened it. When Tolly coming up into the room, she would ask why he had done it, whether he had read it, and what he thought about it. That would be her ruse to turn the conversation away from the hazardous terrain of the stranger's flat to the immediate world of Tomas's thoughts, since she felt his hand on her shoulder. The man took the book out of her hand, put it back on the shelf without a word, and then led her over to the daybed. Again she recalled the words that she had used in the Petron executioner, and said them aloud. But it wasn't my choice. She believed them to be a miraculous formula that would instantly change the situation, but in that room the words lost their magic power. I have a feeling even strengthened the man in the resolve. He pressed himself to her and put a hand on her breast. Oddly enough, the touch of his hand immediately erased what remained of her anxiety. For the engineer's hand referred to her body, and she realized that her soul, was not at all involved, only her body alone, that body that had betrayed her, and that she was sent out into the world among other bodies. "17. He undid the first button of her blouse and indicated she was to continue. She did not comply. She had sent her body out into the world and refused to take any responsibility for it. She neither resisted nor assisted him, her soul thereby announcing that it did not condone what was happening, but decided to remain neutral. She was nearly immobile when he undressed her. When he kissed her, her lips failed to react. Suddenly she felt her groin becoming moist. She was afraid the excitement she felt was all the greater. She excited against her will. In other words, her soul did not condone the proceedings, albeit covertly. But also she knew that if the feeling of excitement was to continue, her soul's approval would have kept mute. The moment it said yes, it allowed. The moment it tried to take active part in the love scene, the excitement would subside. For what made the soul so excited was the body was acting against its will. The body was betraying it. The soul was looking on. Then she pulled off her panties and was completely naked. Then her soul saw her naked body in the arms of a stranger who was so incredulous that it might have all been watching the planet Mars at a close range. In the light of the incredible, the soul for the first time saw the body as something other than banal. For the first time it looked at the body as fascination, all the body's matchless, inimitable, unique qualities had suddenly come to the fore. This was not the most ordinary of bodies. The soul regarded until this was the most extraordinary, but the soul could now to do his way of the body's birthmark, the round blemish above its hairy tongue. It looked up to the always seal had been imprinted on the body. Now a stranger's was moving blasphemously closer, peering into the engineer's face. She would never allow her body, in which the soul had left the mark, to take pleasure in the embrace of the blah embrace of someone she neither knew nor which filled with intoxicating hatred. She collected a glob of saliva to spit in the stranger's face. He was observing her this much as she was him, and noting her rage, he quickly pleaded below the under her body. She could feel them then far, and shouted no to resist it, but resisted, constrained, deprived of an outlet. The ecstasy longer in her body, flowing through the veins like a shot of morphine. She dashed in his arms, swinging her fist in the air, spat in his face. 18. Toilets and modern water closets rise up from the floor like white water lilies. The architect does all he can to make the body forget how paltry it is, and how to make the man ignore what happens to his intestinal waste after the water from the tank flushes them down the drain, even though the sewer pipelines reach far into the houses with their tentacles. They are carefully hidden from the view, and we're happily ignorant of the invisible Venice of crap underlying our bathrooms, bedrooms, dance halls, and parliaments. The bathroom in the old working-class flat on the outskirts of Prague was less hypocritical. The floor was covered with grey tile. The toilet rising up from it was oblong, squat, and pitiful. It did not look like a white water lily. It looked like what it was, an enlarged end of a sewer pipe. And since it lacked even a wooden seat, Teresa had to perch on the cold enamel rim. She was sitting there on the toilet, and her sudden desire to void her bowels was in fact a desire to go to the extreme of the humiliation, to become only an utterly body. The body, her mother used to say, was good for nothing, and was digesting and excreting. And as she avoided her bowels, Teresa was overcome by a feeling of infinite grief and loneliness. Nothing could be more miserable than her naked body perched on the enlarged end of a sewer pipe. Her soul had lost its onlooker's curiosity, its malice and pride. It had retreated deep into the body and into the farthest gut, waiting desperately for someone to call it out. 19. She stood up from the toilet, flushed it, went into the anteroom. The soul trembled in her body, her naked, spurned body. She still felt on her anus the touch of the paper she had used to wipe herself. Suddenly something unforgettable occurred. Suddenly she felt a desire to go into him and hear his voice, his words. If he spoke to her in a soft, deep voice, her soul would take courage and rise to the surface of her body, and she would burst out crying. She would put her arms around him the way she had put her arms around the chestnut tree's thick trunk in her dreams, standing there in the anteroom. She tried to withstand the strong desire to burst out crying in his presence. She knew that her failure to withstand it would have ruinous consequences. She would fall in love with him. Just then his voice called to her from the anteroom. Now that she heard that voice by itself, divorced from the engineer's tall stature, it amazed her. It was high-pitched and thin. How could she have ignored it all this time? Perhaps the surprise of that unpleasant voice was what saved her from temptation. She went inside, picked up her clothes from the floor, threw them on, and left. 20. She had done her shopping and was on her way home. Karanin had the usual roll in his mouth. It was a cold morning. There was a slight frost. There was a passing of a housing development. There were the spaces between buildings and tenements maintained small flower and vegetable gardens. When Karanin suddenly stood stock still and riveted his eyes on something, she looked over and could see nothing out of the ordinary. Karanin gave a tug. She followed along behind. Only then did she notice the black head and large beak of a crow lying on the cold dirt of the barren plot. The bodiless head bobbled slowly up and down, and the beak gave out an occasional hoarse and mournful croak. Karanin was so excited he dropped his roll. Teresa tied him to a tree to prevent him from hurting the crow. Then she knelt down and tried to dig up the soil that had been stamped down around the bird to bury it alive. It was not easy. She broke a nail. The blood began to flow. All at once a rock landed nearby. She turned and caught the sight of 2 9 or 10-year-old boys peeking out from behind a wall. She stood up. They saw her move, saw the dog by the tree, and ran off. One more, she knelt down and scratched away at the dirt. At last she succeeded in pulling the crow out of its grave. But the crow was lame and neither could walk or fly. She wrapped it up in the scarf she had been wearing around her neck, pressed it to her body with her left hand. With her right hand she united Karanin from the tree. It took all the strength, and she must quiet him down to make him heal. She rang the doorbell, not having a free hand for the key. Tomas opened the door. She handed him the leash, and with the words, "Hold him," took the crow into the bathroom. She laid it on the floor of the washman. It flapped its wings a little, but could not move more than that. There was a thick yellow liquid oozing from it. She made a bed of old rags to protect it from the cold tiles. From time to time the bird would give a hopeless flap of lame wing and raise its beak as a reproach. 21. She sat transfixed on the edge of the bath, unable to take her eyes off the dying crow. In its solitude and desolation she saw a reflection of her own fate, and she repeated several times to herself, "I have no one left in the world but Tomas." Did her adventure with the engineer teach her that casual sex had nothing to do with love? That it is light, weightless? Was she calmer now? Not in the least. She kept picturing the following scene. She had come out of the toilet, her body was standing in the anteroom, naked and spurned. Her soul was trembling, terrified, buried in the depths of her bowels. At that moment, the man in the anteroom had addressed her soul. She would have burst out crying and fallen into his arms. She imagined that it would have been like if the woman standing in the anteroom had been one of Tomas's mistresses, and if the man inside had been Tomas. All he would have had to do was say one word, a single word, and the girl would have thrown her arms around him and wept. Teresa knew what happens when the moment love is brewing. The woman cannot resist the voice calling forth her terrified soul. The man cannot resist the woman whose soul thus responds to his voice. Tomas had no defense against the lure of love, and Teresa feared for him every minute of every hour. What weapons did she have at her disposal? None but her fidelity, and she offered him that at the very outset, the very first day, as if aware that she had nothing more to give. Their love was an oddly asymmetrical construction. It was supported by the absolute certainty of her fidelity, like a gigantic edifice supported by a single column. Before long the crow stopped flapping its wings and gave no more than the twitch of a broken mangled egg. Teresa refused to be separated from it. She could have been keeping vigil over the dying sister. In the end, however, she did step into the kitchen for a bite to eat. When she returned, the crow was dead. 22. In the first year of her love, Teresa would cry out during intercourse. Screaming, as I have pointed out, was meant to blind and deafen the senses. With time she screamed less, but her soul was still blinded by love, and she saw nothing. Making love with the engineer in the absence of love was what finally restored her soul's sight. During her next visit to the sauna, she stood before the mirror again and, looking at herself, reviewed the scene of physical love that had taken place in the engineer's flat. It was not her lover she remembered. In fact, she would have been hard to put to describe him. She may not have even noticed what he looked like naked. What she did remember, and what she now observed aroused in the mirror, was her own body, her pubic triangle and her circular blotch, located just above it. The blotch, which until then she had regarded as the most prosaic of skin blemishes, had become an obsession. She longed to see it again and again, in that implausible proximity to an alien. And here I must stress again, she had no desire to see another man's organs. She wished to see her own private parts in close proximity to... She did not desire her lover's body. She desired her own body, newly discovered, intimate and alien beyond all others, incomparably exciting. Looking at her body speckled with droplets of shower water, she imagined the engineer dropping in at the bar. Oh, how she longed for him to come, longed for him to invite her back. Oh, she yearned for it. 23. Every day she feared the engineer would take his appearance, and that she would be unable to say no. But as the days passed, and the fear that he would come merged gradually into the dread that he would not. A month had gone by, and still the engineer stayed away. Teresa found it inexplicable. He frustrated desire receded and turned into a troublesome question. Why did he fail to come? Waiting on customers one day, she came upon the bald-headed man who had attacked her for serving alcohol to a minor. He was telling a dirty joke in a loud voice. It was a joke she had heard 100 times before from the drunks in the small town where she had once served beer. Once more she had the feeling that her mother's world was intruding on her. She curtly interrupted the bald man. I don't take orders from you, the man responded in a huff. You ought to thank your lucky stars we let you stay here in the bar. We? Who do you mean by we? Us, said the man, holding up the glass for another vodka. I won't have any more insults out of you. Is that clear? Oh, and by the way, he added, pointing to Teresa's neck, which was wound round with a strap of cheap pearls. Where did you get those from? You can't tell me your husband gave them to you. A window washer. He can't afford gifts like that. It's your customers, isn't it? I wonder what you gave them in exchange. You shut your mouth this instant, she hissed. Just remember that prostitution is a criminal offense, he went on, trying to grab hold of the necklace. Suddenly Kiernan jumped up, leaped his front paws on the bar, and began to snarl. 24. The ambassador said he's with the secret police. Then why is he so open about it? What good is a secret police that can't keep his secrets? The ambassador positioned himself on the cot by folding his legs under his body, as he had learned to do in yoga class. Kennedy, beaming down on him from the frame of the wall, gave his words a special consecration. The secret police have several functions, my dear, he began in an avuncular tone. The first is a classical one. They keep an ear out for what people are saying and report it to their superiors. The second function is intimidatory. They want to make it seem as though they have us in their power. They want us to be afraid. This is what your bald-headed friend was after. The third function consists of staging situations that will compromise us. Gone are the days when we tried to accuse us of plotting the downfall of the state. That would only increase our popularity. Now they slip hashish in our pockets or claim we've raped a 12-year-old girl. They can always dig up some girl to back them. The engineer immediately popped back into Teresa's mind. Why had he never come? They need to trap people, the ambassador went on, to force them to collaborate and set other traps for other people so that gradually they can turn the whole nation into a single organization of informers. Teresa could think of nothing but the possibility that the engineer had been sent by the police. And who was that strange boy who drank himself silly and told her that he loved her? It was because of him that the bald police spy had launched into her, and the engineer had stood up for her. So all three had been playing parts in a prearranged scenario meant to soften her up for the seduction. How could she have missed it? The flat was so odd, and he didn't belong there at all. Why would an elegantly dressed engineer live in a miserable place like that? Was he an engineer? And if so, how could he leave work at 2 in the afternoon? Besides, how many engineers read Sophocles? No, that was not an engineer's library. The whole place had more flavor of flat confiscated for a poor imprisoned intellectual. Her father was put in prison when she was 10. The state had confiscated their flat and all her father's books. Who knows what to use the flat had been put. Now she saw clearly why the engineer had never returned. He had accomplished his mission. What mission? The drunken undercover agent had inadvertently given away when he said, "Just remember that prostitution is a criminal offense." Now that self-styled engineer would testify that she had slept with him and demanded to be paid. They would threaten to blow it up into a scandal unless she agreed to report on the people who got drunk in her bar. "Don't worry," the ambassador comforted her. "Your story doesn't sound the least bit dangerous." "I suppose it doesn't," she said in a tight voice as she walked out into the Prague night with Karenin. 25. People usually escape from their troubles into the future. They draw an imaginary line across the path of time, a line beyond which their current troubles will cease to exist, but Teresa saw no such line in her future. Only looking back could bring her consolation. It was Sunday again. They got into the car and drove far beyond the limits of Prague. Tomas was at the wheel, Teresa next to him, and Karenin in the back, occasionally leaning over to lick their ears. After 2 hours they came to a small town known for a spa where they had been several days 6 earlier. They wanted to spend the night there. They pulled into the square and got out of the car. Nothing had changed. They stood facing the hotel they had stayed at. The same old linden tree rose up before it. On the left ran an old wooden colonnade, culminating in a stream spouting its medicinal water into a marble bowl. People were bending over it, the same small glasses in hand. When Tomas looked back at the hotel, he noticed that something had in fact changed. What had been the Grand Mail bore the name Baikal. He looked at the street sign in the corner of the building, Moscow Square. When he took the walk, Karenin tagged on his own without a leash. Though all the streets had been known, they examined all their names. Stalingrad Street, Leningrad Street, Rostov Street, Novosibirsk Street, Kiev Street, Odessa Street. There was a Tchaikovsky sanatorium, a Tolstoy sanatorium, a Rimsky-Korsakov sanatorium. There was a Hotel Suvorov, a Gorky cinema, a Cafe Pushkin. All the names were taken from Russian geography, from Russian history. Teresa suddenly recalled the first days of the invasion. People in every city and every town had pulled down street signs. Posts had disappeared. Overnight, the country had become nameless. For 7 days, Russian troops wandered the countryside, not knowing where they were. The officers searched for newspaper offices, for television and radio stations to occupy, but nobody could find them. Whenever they asked, they would get either the shrug or the shoulders or false names and directions. Hindsight now made that anonymity seem quite dangerous to the country. The streets and buildings could no longer return to their original names. As a result, a Czech spa had suddenly metamorphosed into a miniature imaginary Russia, and the past that Teresa had gone there to find had turned out to be confiscated. It was impossible for them to spend the night. 26. They started back to the car at once, silent. She was thinking about how all the things and people seemed to go about in disguise. An old Czech town was covered with Russian names. Czechs taking pictures of the invasion had unconsciously worked for the secret police. The men who sent her to die had worn a mask of Tomas's face over his own. The spy played part of the engineer, and the engineer tried to play the part of the man from Petrin. The emblem of the book in his flat proved a sham designed to lead her astray. Recalling the book she held in her hand there, she had a sudden flash of insight that made her cheeks burn red. What had been the sequence of events? The engineer announced that he would bring in some coffee. She walked over to the bookshelves and took down Sophocles' Oedipus. Then the engineer came back, but without the coffee. Again and again she returned to that situation. How long was he away, and when he went for coffee? Surely a minute, at least, maybe 2 or even 3. And what had he been up to for so long in that miniature anteroom? Or had he gone to the toilet? She tried to remember hearing the door shut or water flush. No, she was positive she heard no water. She would have remembered that. She was almost certain the door hadn't closed. What had he been up to in that anteroom? It was only too clear. If they meant to trap her, they would need more than the engineer's testimony. They would need incontrovertible evidence. In the course of his suspiciously long absence, the engineer could have been setting up a movie camera in the anteroom, or more likely, he had let in someone with a still camera who had then photographed them from behind the curtain. Only a few weeks earlier, she had scoffed at Prochaska, for failing to see that he lived in a concentration camp where privacy ceased to exist. But what about her? By getting out from under her mother's roof, she thought in all innocence that she had once and for all become master of her privacy. But no, her mother's roof stretched out over the whole world and would never let her be. Teresa would never escape her. As they walked down the garden-lined steps leading back to the square, Tomas asked her what's wrong. Before she could respond, someone called out a greeting to Tomas. 27. He was a man of about 50 with a weather-beaten face, a farm worker whom Tomas had once operated on, and who was sent to the spa once a year for treatment. He invited Tomas and Teresa to have a glass of wine with him. Since the law prohibited dogs from entering public places, Teresa took Aaron back to the car while the men found a table at a nearby cafe. When she came up to them, the man was saying, "We live a quiet life. 2 years ago, they even elected me chairman of the collective." "Congratulations," said Tomas. "You know how it is. People are dying to move to the city big shots. Are happy when somebody wants to stay put. They can't fire us from our jobs." "It would be ideal for us," said Teresa. "You'd be bored to tears, ma'am. There's nothing to do there, nothing at all." Teresa looked into the farmer worker's weather-beaten face. She found him very kind. For the first time in ages she had found someone kind. An image of life in the country arose before her eyes, an image of a village with a belfry, fields, woods, a rabbit scampering along, a hunter with a green cap. She had never lived in the country. Her image of it came entirely from what she had heard or read or received unconsciously from distant ancestors, and yet it lived within her, as plain and clear as the doggerel type of her great-grandmother in the family album. "Does it give you any trouble?" Tomas asked. The farmer pointed out to the area in the back of the neck where the brain is connected to the spinal cord. "I still have pains here from time to time." Without getting out of his seat, Tomas palpated the spot and put his former patient through a brief examination. "I no longer have the right to prescribe drugs," he said after he had finished, "but I'll the doctor taking care of you now that you talked to me, and I recommend you use this." And tearing a sheet of paper from the pad in his wallet, he wrote out the name of the medicine in large letters, 28. They started back to Prague. All the way, Teresa brooded about the photograph showing her naked body embracing the engineer. She tried to console herself with the thought that even if the picture did exist, Tomas would never see it. The only value it held for them was a blackmailing device. It would lose that value the moment they had sent it to Tomas. What if the police decided somewhere along the way that they couldn't use her? Then the picture would become more of a plaything in their hands, and nothing would prevent them from slipping it in an envelope and sending it off to Tomas just for the fun of it. What would happen if Tomas were to receive such a picture? Would he throw her out? Perhaps not, probably not, but the fragile edifice of their love would certainly come tumbling down, for that edifice rested on the single column of her fidelity, and loves are like empires. When the idea they are founded on crumbles, they too fade away, and now she had an image before her eyes, a rabbit scampering along a furrow, a hunter with a green cap, and the belfry of a village church rising up out of the woods. She wanted to tell Tomas that they should leave Prague, leave the children who bury crows alive in the ground, leave the police spies, leave the young women armed with umbrellas. She wanted to tell them that they should move to the country, that it was their only path to salvation. She turned to him, but Tomas did not respond. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. Having thus failed to see the scale of fence of silence between them, she lost all courage to speak. She felt as if she had felt when walking down Petrin Hill. Her stomach was in knots, and she thought she was going to be sick. She was afraid of Tomas. He was too strong for her. She was too weak. He gave her commands that she could not understand. She tried to carry them out. He did not know how. She wanted to go back to Petrin Hill and ask the man with the rifle to wind the blindfold around her eyes and let her lean against the trunk of the chestnut tree. She wanted to die. 29. Waking up, she realized she was at home alone. She went outside and set off in the direction of the embankment. She wanted to see the Vltava. She wanted to stand on its banks and look long and hard into its waters, because the sight of the flow was soothing and healing. The river flowed from century to century, and human affairs played themselves out on its banks, play themselves out and be forgotten the next day while the river flows on. Leaning against the balustrade, she peered into the water. She was on the outskirts of Prague. The Vltava had already flowed through the city, leaving behind the glory of the castle and the churches like an actress after a performance. It was tired and contemplative. It flowed between its dirty banks, and bounded by the walls and fences themselves, bounded factories and abandoned playgrounds. She was staring at the water. It seemed sadder and darker here, when suddenly she spied a strange object in the middle of the river, something grassy. It was red. It was a bench. A wooden bench on iron legs, the kind Prague's parks were bound in. It was floating down the Vltava, followed by another and another and another, and only then did Teresa realize that all the park benches of Prague were floating downstream away from the city, many, many benches, more and more, drifting by like the autumn leaves that the water carries off in the woods, red, yellow, blue. She turned to look behind her as if the passerby asked what it meant. Why are Prague's park benches floating downstream? But everyone passed her by, indifferent, for little did they care that a river flowed from century to century through the ephemeral city. Again she looked down at the river. She was grief-stricken. She understood that what she saw was a farewell. When most of the benches had vanished from sight, a few latecomers appeared. One more yellow one, then another blue, the last.